They claimed to be cops, but one perfect lawn blew their whole scam wide open. The neighborhood had been under a drought advisory for weeks, with city notices encouraging residents to limit water usage and consider turning off automatic irrigation systems. While no formal ban had been announced yet, signs urging water conservation lined the roads. Residents took it seriously, some out of civic responsibility, others out of fear of hefty municipal fines that might come later. It was during this period of rising concern that a few residents began receiving unexpected visits. Two men, dressed in uniforms that closely resembled those of local law enforcement, started knocking on doors. They carried clipboards, wore badges, and introduced themselves as officers from a newly formed water regulation task force, supposedly created to enforce emergency sprinkler restrictions. The men appeared professional and firm, asserting that water usage violations had been reported in the area and that routine inspections were now underway. Caught off guard, residents listened. The supposed officers cited Section 19.4b of the Environmental Water Code, a regulation that sounded real enough to pass without immediate scrutiny. They explained that sprinklers using more than a specified flow rate were now considered illegal and subject to fines under a new ordinance. Without much resistance, they began issuing written citations on carbon copy paper, requesting immediate payment or promising that a city invoice would follow. The amounts varied, usually between $100 and $250, just low enough to feel like an annoying penalty, but high enough to be taken seriously. Some residents, worried about further trouble, chose to pay cash on the spot. The men even provided receipts and stamped the citations with a generic-looking seal. Those who didn't pay were told they would be flagged and subject to further inspection. For the first few visits, nobody thought to question the legitimacy of the operation. The uniforms, the terminology, the use of clipboards and official-sounding language, it all contributed to the illusion of authority. Most people assumed it was a real, if poorly publicized, city enforcement effort. Soon, word of the enforcement spread through neighborhood group chats and local forums. Questions started surfacing. Some residents had received visits, others hadn't. The rules being enforced weren't clearly listed on the city's website, and no press release or official announcement could be found to confirm the existence of the so-called Water Regulation Task Force. Skepticism began to form at the edges. One resident noted that the citation paper lacked any identifying logos or government contact information, just a generic header and the fine amount. Another pointed out that real officers never ask for cash payments on the spot. But confusion reigned. People were unsure whether this was just a communication failure from city officials or something more deceptive. Despite growing unease, many continued to comply. The presence of men in uniform tapping on doors created a psychological pressure, an unspoken expectation that questioning their authority would make things worse. Residents turned off sprinkler timers, unplugged irrigation boxes, and manually watered with hoses only during early mornings. Lawns began to dry out, turning patchy and brown. Meanwhile, some households didn't receive any visits at all. Their lawns stayed green, their sprinklers ran regularly, and not a single citation was issued. This inconsistency fueled rumors and suspicions. Were the inspectors skipping certain houses? Was there favoritism involved? Or were the visits random? In a short time, the neighborhood was divided. On one side were those who accepted the fines as real, believing they had violated a rule they weren't aware of. On the other side were those who began to smell a scam but lacked evidence to take any action. Fear of city enforcement lingered, and without definitive confirmation, no one felt confident enough to challenge the supposed officers directly. The situation created a tense atmosphere. Conversations shifted. Instead of neighbors discussing weather, school, or community events, talk centered around sprinkler heads, watering schedules, and how to avoid getting fined. People began policing themselves and each other, creating subtle resentments. Someone with a greener-than-average lawn was viewed with suspicion. Others wondered if reporting a neighbor could earn favor with the task force. Amid this growing confusion, one thing became clear. The presence of the fake officers had created a ripple effect of control without any actual legal authority. Simply showing up with the appearance of power was enough to change behavior and sow doubt. The illusion was powerful until it started to unravel. As word of the so-called sprinkler enforcement spread, the mood in the neighborhood began to shift dramatically. What began as isolated visits quickly evolved into a full-blown sense of panic. Residents who had received citations shared their experiences in community forums, WhatsApp groups, and Facebook neighborhood pages. Messages were short, urgent, and filled with confusion. Got fined for sprinklers, one message read. Who else did they visit? Asked another. Screenshots of citations were posted online, sparking discussions, debates, and a steady stream of speculation. The rapid sharing of information had unintended consequences. Without clear guidance from any official city source, residents began making assumptions based on limited and often conflicting details. A belief formed that the city had quietly passed a water usage ordinance and had sent officers out to enforce it without warning. Others believed it was a pilot program targeting high-usage zones. No one could confirm anything definitively, but few were willing to risk being wrong. In this uncertain climate, many residents acted quickly and decisively. Some disabled their entire irrigation systems, fearing a second citation might result in a higher fine or even legal action. Others, not wanting to appear defiant or uncooperative, removed their sprinkler heads entirely or dug up lawn piping to demonstrate compliance. The more extreme cases involved residents hiring landscapers to redesign lawns for dry landscaping or xeriscaping, believing this might shield them from further scrutiny. A few households reported paying their fines in cash as instructed and receiving stamped receipts in return. They later shared these receipts online in an attempt to help others identify what was real and what wasn't. But the variations between receipts only deepened the confusion. Some had serial numbers, others didn't. Some cited obscure water codes, others simply said sprinkler violation. The lack of consistency raised more questions than answers. In group chats, tension escalated. Residents began questioning each other. Posts appeared accusing neighbors of overwatering or causing the rest of us to get inspected. Some suggested that reporting violators might prevent future visits to their own homes. This created an atmosphere of mutual suspicion. Homeowners began adjusting sprinkler schedules to run only before sunrise or after midnight, thinking this would reduce visibility. A few even stopped watering altogether, sacrificing the condition of their lawns out of fear. Yards that had once been a source of pride turned brown within days. Lawns were left untrimmed, flower beds neglected, and many removed decorative irrigation entirely. Homeowners who had recently invested in automated irrigation systems were especially frustrated. They had followed regulations, used certified equipment, and set timers in line with previous conservation guidelines. Now, those very systems were being treated as violations. Amid this growing panic, rumors flourished. Some residents claimed the officers had threatened to escalate fines to $500 if they returned and found no action had been taken. Others shared that certain homes were skipped due to having connections at City Hall, fueling conspiracy theories and social rifts. A few believed the enforcement team had access to satellite images or smart meter data and was targeting homes using more water than average. None of this was ever confirmed, but it didn't matter. People acted on what they believed to be true. Efforts to get answers from city officials met dead ends. Phone lines were flooded, emails went unanswered, and the city website had no updates related to any new sprinkler enforcement program. Residents who went to city offices in person reported that staff seemed unaware of the issue altogether, further clouding the situation. Some were told to file formal complaints, but without solid proof that anything illegal had occurred, there was little recourse. At the same time, a small minority of skeptical residents began piecing things together. They noted that the uniforms the so-called officers wore lacked the official city crest. The citation forms lacked any kind of barcode, case number, or payment processing information linked to a government system. these observations were shared. But for every voice of doubt, there were several still caught in the grip of fear. The panic was self-sustaining. The more lawns dried out, the more people believed the threat was real. Neighborhood associations, typically passive in water use matters, suddenly found themselves overwhelmed. They issued their own advisories urging members to comply with any enforcement officials and cooperate with inspections. Board members debated whether to hold an emergency meeting or contact city legal teams. Some associations even began drafting water usage guidelines of their own, hoping to get ahead of further issues. As the panic continued to spread, a deeper psychological effect took hold. Residents no longer felt safe in their own yards. A simple act like turning on a garden hose or watering potted plants was done cautiously, with glances over shoulders. People avoided talking about their lawns or outdoor care, worried it might invite judgment, or worse, another visit. The panic had taken hold not because of a real policy or enforceable law, but because of trust in appearances. The badges, clipboards, uniforms, and confident language had created the illusion of authority. That illusion, coupled with rapid digital communication, proved powerful enough to change behavior on a massive scale. Amid a neighborhood consumed by fear and reactive compliance, one property stood out from the rest. While lawns across the area withered to dull patches of beige and brown, one home maintained a vibrant, deep green landscape that seemed immune to drought conditions and enforcement panic. The property belonged to a longtime resident named Karen, known to many in the community for her meticulous lawn care and outspoken views on neighborhood standards. Her lawn had always been a subject of both admiration and annoyance, depending on who was asked. However, under the shadow of supposed sprinkler enforcement, it became something more, an anomaly that defied the pattern. Unlike other homes that had adjusted or shut off their sprinkler systems entirely, Karen's lawn showed no signs of water restriction. The grass was freshly mowed, the borders precisely edged, and the plants remained lush and flowering. Sprinkler heads were still visible, and traces of recent watering, such as damp soil and puddling along the curb, were regularly observed. Despite this, her home had not received a citation, nor had she reported any visit from the so-called Water Regulation Task Force. Neighbors began to take notice. Comparisons quickly emerged. Homeowners who had received warnings or fines were puzzled as to why Karen's property seemed untouched. Some speculated that her system must have been upgraded to meet whatever obscure regulation was being enforced, though no one had seen contractors or landscapers at work. Others believed she might have installed a private well or water recycling system, though no such infrastructure had been noted before. Theories multiplied but offered no clarity. Eventually, the inconsistency became too stark to ignore. Her lawn was the only one in a several-block radius that had retained full coverage and health. The plants had not suffered, and the grass showed none of the dehydration visible elsewhere. More importantly, there had been no reports of Karen expressing concern, confusion, or frustration, emotions that had become standard across neighborhood group chats. Her silence stood out as much as her grass. A few residents began quietly documenting the disparity, sharing side-by-side images of Karen's thriving yard and their own dry, crumbling landscapes. These comparisons circulated in digital conversations and became the basis for sharper questions. Why had one of the most visibly watered properties in the neighborhood not drawn the attention of enforcement agents? How had a lawn that so clearly defied the community trend been overlooked? The questions naturally turned toward possible favoritism or inside knowledge. Karen's social history within the neighborhood added fuel to this theory. She had long participated in homeowners association meetings and had developed a reputation for assertiveness, often pushing for strict adherence to community rules on fence heights, trash bins, paint colors, and landscape design. Some believed she wielded more influence than most residents realized. As scrutiny increased, it emerged that Karen had previous ties to one of the men who had been visiting homes as part of the so-called enforcement effort. Through social media and local background checks, neighbors discovered connections dating back several years. Photos from block parties and volunteer events revealed that Karen had interacted with at least one of the uniformed individuals issuing fines. Although such evidence was circumstantial, it supported a growing belief that her home had been intentionally bypassed, not due to compliance, but due to familiarity or cooperation. More suspicion arose from behavioral inconsistencies. While most residents had been either frantic or confused about the visits, Karen had remained conspicuously unaffected. She had not participated in online discussions, offered warnings to neighbors, or shared advice about how to deal with the fines. When asked directly, she reportedly deflected or changed the subject. To some, this was a sign of discomfort. To others, it was a clear indication of foreknowledge. As the theory of preferential treatment gained traction, it also began to undermine the legitimacy of the entire enforcement campaign. If one resident had been selectively protected, the implication was that the rules were not applied universally, that in turn raised the question of whether the rules were real at all. A growing faction within the neighborhood began to challenge the citations themselves, not based on legal knowledge, but on the glaring inconsistency of Karen's experience. This shift in perception had measurable effects. Some residents stopped responding to the man in uniform entirely, refusing entry to their property or requesting written proof of authority. Others began demanding refunds for cash they had paid, citing Karen's lawn as proof of fraudulent enforcement. Online posts increasingly framed Karen not just as a lucky exception, but as a participant in the scheme. She became a symbol of what was wrong, not just a resident with a green lawn, but the embodiment of a broken and possibly corrupt system. In the days that followed, the neighborhood's focus shifted from compliance to investigation. The lush, untouched lawn had become more than a landscaping feat. It was now evidence. And in a community starved for answers, it marked the beginning of the unraveling. The rising suspicion surrounding Karen's untouched lawn acted as a catalyst for deeper scrutiny. Residents who had initially accepted the supposed enforcement without question began to look for patterns and inconsistencies in the visits. Conversations shifted from speculation to investigation. Small groups formed with the shared goal of uncovering what was really happening. Attention to detail became sharper. Residents started keeping logs of when and where the fake officers appeared, noting which houses were targeted and which were consistently ignored. It quickly became evident that the pattern of visits was not random. Homes with visible, active sprinkler systems were prioritized. Those with newer irrigation installations or noticeable water usage habits were common targets. However, though officers appeared to skip certain properties entirely, properties like Karen's, where watering was obvious yet no enforcement action was taken. This discovery deepened the belief that the operation was not about compliance or conservation, but about selectively exploiting unsuspecting residents. A few community members decided to quietly monitor the movements of the so-called officers. Instead of confronting them directly, residents tracked their route, the duration of their stops, and their interactions. One crucial observation stood out. After bypassing Karen's property without stopping, the officers were seen entering her backyard briefly before moving on. No paperwork was issued, no warnings left behind, and no citations were discussed. The nature of the visit suggested familiarity rather than enforcement. This observation led to a closer look at the relationship between Karen and the imposters. Online searches revealed previously unnoticed connections. Photos from community events showed Karen in conversation with one of the men posing as an officer. Comments on social media posts hinted at a long-standing acquaintanceship. Although these clues were circumstantial, they began to paint a picture of coordination rather than coincidence. Information gathered over several days suggested that Karen had not only known the fake officers, but had also provided them with key details about the neighborhood's water habits. Several residents recalled casual conversations with her over the past months, during which she asked unusually specific questions about sprinkler systems, irrigation schedules, and lawn care strategies. At the time, her inquiries were dismissed as typical neighborhood chatter. In hindsight, they seemed strategic, designed to gather intelligence that could later be exploited. Further evidence emerged when residents cross-referenced the list of targeted homes with known information about sprinkler installations. Most of the homes found were ones that had recently upgraded or repaired their irrigation systems, often at significant cost. These improvements had been discussed openly at neighborhood association meetings, social gatherings, and even in online posts. Karen had been a regular participant in these spaces, often complimenting or commenting on such upgrades. It became apparent that she had access to exactly the kind of insider information that would make targeting more efficient. The revelation that Karen might have been an active participant in the scam sent shockwaves through the community. Trust, already fragile, began to collapse completely. Residents felt doubly betrayed, not only by the men impersonating officers, but by a neighbor many had known and interacted with for years. The idea that someone from within the community had leveraged personal relationships for financial gain intensified the anger and sense of violation. As more pieces of the puzzle fell into place, a clearer theory formed. Karen had likely collaborated with the fake officers by identifying homes most likely to pay without resistance, those with expensive systems, visible water use, and a heightened fear of noncompliance. In return, she received protection from citations and was able to continue watering her own lawn freely while others sacrificed theirs. This theory explained the inconsistencies in enforcement, the selective targeting, and the glaring exception of Karen's flourishing yard. It also shed light on the overall strategy of the scam. By appearing legitimate and targeting residents most vulnerable to fines, the imposters had created an efficient, short-term revenue scheme with minimal risk until the inconsistencies became too obvious to ignore. The realization of Karen's involvement transformed the tone of neighborhood conversations. Discussions that had once focused on compliance and confusion now shifted to accountability and retribution. Residents who had paid cash fines demanded explanations and began compiling evidence to present to actual law enforcement. Group chats were flooded with photos, timestamps, screenshots, and anecdotal accounts, creating an informal but growing case file against both the imposters and their alleged accomplice. At the same time, resentment grew toward the systems that had allowed the scam to flourish. The lack of clear communication from city authorities, the absence of visible enforcement standards, and the heavy reliance on trust in uniforms and badges were all cited as factors that made the community vulnerable. What started as anger toward outsiders shifted to include self-criticism. Many residents realized they had been too quick to comply without demanding verification, too willing to assume legitimacy based on appearance alone. The cracks in the scam, once small and almost invisible, had widened into gaping holes. The carefully crafted illusion of authority collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The realization that a well-watered lawn had exposed the entire operation underscored a hard truth for the neighborhood. Appearances, no matter how convincing, can be deceiving. Trust, once broken, is not easily restored. Once the pieces of the scam became clear, the neighborhood shifted from outrage to action. The informal investigation conducted by residents culminated in a coordinated effort to alert real law enforcement. Armed with compiled evidence including photographs, receipts, timelines, and eyewitness accounts, several residents jointly filed formal complaints with the city's police department. Unlike previous individual attempts that had been brushed aside due to lack of evidence, the collective documentation now presented an undeniable pattern of fraud. The police responded swiftly. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation and the level of organization involved, they launched an official investigation. Within days, undercover officers were dispatched to the neighborhood to observe the impersonators in action. As expected, the fake officers continued their routine, moving from home to home, issuing fake citations, and collecting cash payments. Their behavior, once unquestioned, now operated under silent surveillance. It did not take long for the police to intervene. During an attempted citation at a home that had agreed in advance to cooperate with law enforcement, officers moved in. The impersonators were caught with forged badges, fake citation forms, and cash collected from multiple households. Their uniforms, upon closer inspection, were revealed to be generic security outfits with no legitimate ties to any government body. The entire setup, clipboards, seals, badges, was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated illusion. The arrests sent a wave of relief through the neighborhood, but attention quickly turned to Karen. Although she was not physically present during the enforcement attempts, her role in the operation had become an open secret. Her exemption from fines, her knowledge of residents' sprinkler systems, and her connections to the arrested individuals painted a damning picture. Public outrage grew rapidly. Residents demanded accountability, not only from the arrested men, but also from anyone who had helped facilitate their actions. Petitions circulated calling for Karen to be formally investigated. Some residents pushed for her expulsion from the Homeowners Association and for civil action to recover damages. What had begun as silent resentment now erupted into an organized movement for justice. Faced with mounting pressure, law enforcement opened a parallel investigation into Karen's involvement. While initial evidence was circumstantial, interviews with neighbors, recovered communications, and financial records began to reveal a deeper connection. Messages exchanged between Karen and one of the arrested imposters hinted at prior planning, sharing information about which homes to target, and discussing the best times to make visits without arousing suspicion. As investigators built their case, Karen found herself increasingly isolated. Friends and allies within the neighborhood distanced themselves. Her once pristine reputation as a community leader crumbled. Her lawn, once the symbol of quiet defiance, became a symbol of guilt, standing in stark contrast to the dead and struggling yard surrounding her home. Formal charges were eventually filed. While the exact legal consequences would take time to unfold, the community treated the takedown as a victory. The arrests and pending charges validated the concerns of residents who had questioned the legitimacy of the operation from the beginning. It also exposed the vulnerabilities in the neighborhood's trust structures, vulnerabilities that the scam had exploited with devastating effectiveness. The aftermath brought significant changes. Homeowners became more vigilant, questioning unfamiliar authority figures and demanding official verification for any enforcement action. The Homeowners Association revised its protocols, issuing guidance on how to verify the legitimacy of city representatives and encouraging residents to report suspicious activity immediately. Workshops on recognizing scams and frauds were organized, with law enforcement providing resources to help communities protect themselves. The city government, embarrassed by how easily the imposters had mimicked official operations, issued a public statement. Officials clarified that no water regulation task force had ever been created and that no emergency sprinkler ordinances had been enacted. They apologized for the confusion and pledged to improve communication with residents in the future. Beyond institutional changes, the takedown left lasting emotional impacts. Trust among neighbors already damaged would take time to rebuild. People became more cautious in casual conversations, wary of sharing personal details that could be exploited. The scam had not only cost residents money and peace of mind, it had eroded the social fabric that held the neighborhood together. Still, amid the damage, there was also a sense of empowerment. The neighborhood had ultimately exposed the fraud through collective vigilance and persistence. By refusing to accept inconsistencies and demanding accountability, the residents had reclaimed control over their community. It was a hard-earned lesson. Authority must be verified, appearances can deceive, and sometimes the health of a lawn can reveal more about the truth than any uniform or badge. In the end, justice was served. The fake officers faced criminal charges for impersonating law enforcement and fraud. Karen faced legal repercussions for aiding and abetting the operation. The lush green lawn that had once symbolized privilege and impunity now stood as a cautionary reminder of how deception can flourish and how determined communities can tear it down. If you found this story as unbelievable and as eye-opening as we did, make sure you stay alert and question what seems suspicious, even if it looks official. Scams can show up where you least expect them, even in your own neighborhood. Stay informed, stay strong, and never be afraid to stand up for the truth. For more jaw-dropping real-life twists and community battles you won't believe. Don't forget to subscribe to expect stories. Hit that like button, share the story with your friends, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. The next unbelievable story is just around the corner, and you won't miss it.